Hello and welcome to this Cushwa Center book conversation. My name is Philip Byers, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. We've been grateful only recently to begin resuming some socially distanced in-person events, but over the past year we also learned how recorded conversations have helped us extend our programming to a wider audience. Now, the sad prelude to all of this, of course, was the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and the forced cancellation of several events that spring, including a planned lecture on what was at that time a forthcoming book. So after this 18-month delay, it is my special pleasure today to welcome Professor Elesha Coffman, who is the author of the now published Margaret Mead, A 20th-Century Faith, out with Oxford University Press. Elesha is Associate Professor of History at Baylor University, where her research and teaching focus on religion and intellectual history. She holds a BA from Wheaton College and both an MA and PhD from Duke University. And before arriving in Waco, she held appointments at Waynesburg University and the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. Her first book, The Christian Century and the Rise of the Protestant Mainline, was published in 2013, also by Oxford, and along with work on her current book project, titled Turning Points in American Church History, she also serves as editor of the journal Fides et Historia. She regularly publishes commentary in outlets including The Washington Post, Christianity Today, and Comment, along with scholarly articles in a range of journals, so you can and should seek out her other work. But today, our conversation is all about Margaret Mead, A 20th-Century Faith. So I want to welcome you, Elesha. We're so grateful to have you join us at long last.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I was hoping to open our conversation today with a bit of an origin story. So your first book that I just mentioned is really, it's a cultural history of an institution. You know, individuals crop up along the way. But your main focus is on explaining a somewhat abstract concept, what you called the idea of the mainline. So I'm curious how you made the move, generally to the genre of biography, but then specifically to the person of Margaret Mead.
It was entirely because I was asked to write about her. Tim Larson at Wheaton College is the series editor for the Spiritual Lives series, which is billed as the lives of famous 19th and 20th century British and American figures who are famous for something other than being spiritual. And Larson had written a book, The Slain God, on anthropologists and religion. And he knew that Margaret Mead fit his category of someone who was famous for something other than being spiritual. But he didn't really have room for her in that book. But he was projecting out volumes for the Spiritual Lives series and wanted a volume on her. She was a mainline Protestant. She was Episcopalian. I had never met him, but he knew that I wrote on mainline Protestants, and I guess thought that was close enough. So he emailed me out of the blue and said, launching this series, would like a volume on Margaret Mead. What do you think? I had to Google her. I didn't know, I vaguely knew she was an anthropologist. That was all I knew. So I never would have found my way to this project at all, except that I was invited to write on her, and so glad that I was, because she's endlessly fascinating, or at least I think she is.
Sure. And was there any type of trepidation in terms of the switch to genre, or pure excitement about kind of a new venture?
There was definitely trepidation, although less, I think, on the genre. Her collection at the Library of Congress is the largest collection at the Library of Congress. It's 531,000 items. And then it was a blessing that this was for this Spiritual Lives series, because as you held up the very compact book, they're only 80,000 words. And so there was no fear that I would never spend enough time in the archives. I would never find everything. This was not going to be the complete final word on any of this. This was the first person writing about her religious life. And so because it was bounded and I was on a fairly short schedule for my department, I was so grateful for the parameters of the series that I was able to do something and dive into it and get it done and get it out there, because otherwise you could easily spend 20 years just in the archive.
Well, that's a perfect segue, actually, to my next question, which is related to research method. So as I read the book, I noticed that along with your archival research, you also draw upon some of the records of Mead's confidants, especially her daughter, the scholar Mary Catherine Bateson, but then also a lengthy interview that Mead gave to her friend, the philosopher Jean Houston, and then even memories of other former intimates, some of her husbands. So this is a fairly different source base than what you worked with on your history of the Christian century. How did you approach this type of material?
There was an autobiography. Charles Clayton Morrison, the longtime editor of the Christian Century, wrote an unfinished, very odd autobiography. So that was probably more of a source for the first book than you'd have to look in the footnotes pretty closely. So the unpublished Jean Houston interview did some of that same kind of work. And people have known about this interview because it's in the papers, both the unedited and an edited version, though it never came out. The big biography of Mead, still the standard one, is the Jane Howard 1984. And that was soon after Mead's passing. Jane Howard talked to a lot of people who knew her in all different phases of her life. By the time I was getting at it, those sources weren't really available. I was able to talk to Mary Catherine Bateson on the phone. She was lovely. I was also able to talk to Mead's partner's son, Daniel Metro, on the phone. I hadn't talked to any living people for the first book. It's a dumb reason. While I was at Duke, a researcher over in the hard sciences somewhere did something bad with research protocols. And so the whole university was put on notice: if you're working with human subjects, you need to do this extensive training. And it wasn't clear whether historians talking to people was human subjects. And I just didn't want to go through hours and hours and hours of training. So I was like, I'm just not going to talk to anyone. I happened to be in an elevator with historian Martin Marty, who figures in that book. And I was like, can I ask him? And I did, and I footnoted it.
The Institutional Review Board will never know.
I hoped no one would notice. So for this book, I was going back to the Jane Howard biography, the Jean Houston interview, so getting that at second hand. It was only Mary Catherine Bateson and Daniel Metro that I was talking to directly. I tried to corroborate or match anything that they said with something that they had written or published earlier. Mostly it was so fun to be able to talk to them, and they were both so supportive because their mom or their mom's partner, obviously so famous, lots of controversies around her and surrounding her legacy after she died. Nobody had asked about her religion, but this was very important to her. It was very important to both of the children that I talked to, who both also became Episcopalians. It would have been hard if they were very concerned or not supportive, but they were really supportive. And it was just really sad. Mary Catherine Bateson died about the week that the book came out. And so I was looking up an address for her to send it, and that's when I found the death notices. So I was able to send it to her daughter instead.
I'm sure that meant a lot. You are once again teeing me up, question for question. So now that we've got a little bit of a feel for how you approach the project at the start, we're going to start digging into the content. The book's subtitle, 20th Century Faith, it's not just a placeholder or filler. It really gestures toward part of the argument you make. You describe in the book's final paragraph that Mead called herself, quote, a newer kind of person that's only made possible in this century for the things that are happening in this century. So I'd love for you to expound on that for us a little bit. What did she mean, and what was some of the context that helped make this newer kind of person?
Right. The context for that quote, I think she was talking about developments in psychology. So not what you would initially think. She studied psychology undergrad and master's before switching to anthropology. So some of what she meant was that and she was exposed to Freudianism, Erik Erikson, Jung, things like that. Without that psychological apparatus, she wouldn't have been able to see what she saw in the field or write what she wrote. So I think that's what she meant by it there. She also was very responsive to big events in the 20th century. Probably the hinge point was the use of nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. She wrote that she had a book in process and she ripped it up when she heard about that, because nothing that anyone wrote or thought before that event was really relevant afterward. She didn't rip it up. There's pieces of it still out there. But she was responding to that event for the rest of her life, feeling that as an anthropologist who was used to going out in the field, finding societies that were changing, being encroached upon by colonial interests and economic interests, but it was still possible to be isolated in certain ways. And if a society a tragedy befell them, that was a great loss, but it was somewhat localized. Whereas after nuclear weapons, and then after she saw the environmental movement, environmental degradation, things like air pollution, all human beings were in this together. Then another thing, when they got the first pictures of Earth from space, and the sense that everybody's on this little blue marble together, none of that you could have a sense of before the 20th century at all. Although one of the reasons I chose it as the subtitle was that Mead published a book of theological essays called 20th Century Faith, and nobody reads it. Nobody knows that it exists. So to be able to point people to that book with the subtitle was the other reason that I went with it.
Great. Well, again, this is what I wanted to talk about next, which is more the content. So both, implicit in including Mead in this series, and then explicitly, as you've started to argue, religion was essential for her. It was also complex. So you point out in the book, theology didn't really motivate her. She once referenced all the things in which I can't believe, and these included an omnipotent God, immortality, original sin, some of the things generally, associated with Christianity. And you even record her description of the very notion of belief, this is another quote, as one of the unfortunate inventions on the whole of the Western world. But the book does describe these various features of religion that really did matter to her. So human relationships and service, aesthetics, ritual, and then especially worship. But this also somewhat begs a question, which is, what was worship for Mead? Did it have an object? What was it helping her approach or access? I'd love to hear more about what it meant for her.
Yeah, that is a tricky one. I think when I was at Duke, the first time I was teaching my own class, it was World Religions in America, and I'd inherited that from Julie Byrne, who used Catherine Albanese's text and the framework that a religion is creed, code, cultus, and community, which is not the way that I had been raised within churches. I think without getting some of that religious studies apparatus, I would have been completely flummoxed by someone like Mead. How can you be a Christian without the creedal elements? Because everything goes downhill from the creedal elements, right? Well, it sometimes does, and sometimes doesn't so much. The ritual aspect, the way she has a pamphlet about ritual in a cosmic sense. So a sense of awe, a sense of something beyond what we can and see and touch here. Ritual as connecting people across generations, through history, around the world. She was very, very interested in how that worked, what that did for individuals, what that did for societies. But yeah, famously left cold by any kind of dogma. She didn't, even in the book of theological essays, she doesn't really talk about a personal God. I don't know that Jesus was ever a very big figure for her. But being in a place that was set aside for worship, that was very important to her, sacred space. She wrote about that at Columbia. They were trying to figure out what to do with what had been a chapel space there amidst the cultural upheavals of the 1960s. And she was very adamant that there needs to be a space still where things can happen, that they can be safe, that can be transcendent, that can point beyond themselves. But she could also, she had a capacity for it. She didn't always stay for an entire church service. Or once she went to a sort of spiritual retreat that had a lot of Greek Orthodox worship, and she wrote to her daughter, this is really lovely, but I'm ready to be done and move on to something else. I'm maxed out on this.
Great. Well, you gestured there again towards another topic I wanted to mention. You described her interest in these connections around the world. So along with highlighting her interest in ritual, you also describe how much she sought universality. She once claimed that what the great religions have is an inclusiveness that brings together, that begins to include the whole world. So given these kind of paired commitments, ritual and liturgy, along with universality, I was somewhat surprised she didn't engage more with the Christian tradition that styles itself as universal, Catholic, general. What did she make of Roman Catholicism?
I think that she didn't engage more with Roman Catholicism because Roman Catholicism didn't engage more with the ecumenical movement of the mid and late 20th century. And there were reasons that they weren't participating in the World Council of Churches or the National Council of Churches in the same way. I think in part because of the sense that the Roman Catholic Church is already the global universal church. So a seat at a table that's inclusive, Roman Catholics would have to betray some of who they understood themselves to be to participate in that way. I've also seen in some archival work, not so much for this project, there were some Catholics who wanted to participate in ecumenical movement, that kind of liturgical renewal, ecumenical meetings in particular city settings. They usually couldn't get permission. And sometimes I wondered if that was kind of the pocket veto of the hierarchy. If you just keep passing these requests around until the event is over, and then you don't have to deal with what would it mean for us as Roman Catholics to have a seat at a table where these other people are represented. So functionally, Mead is interacting with other Protestants and some Orthodox believers. Catholics aren't in her circle so much. They weren't on her radar so much. And there would have been some issues that she would have really objected to, reproductive issues. She was committed to women having access to birth control and legal abortion and things like that. So that, I think that would have been a problem if they'd had more opportunities to, I think if there had been interface, there would have been friction on things like that.
Yeah, and certainly even within your first book, to your point, to whatever degree Mead was a creature of liberal Protestantism or the main line at the time, she would not have been alone in having few points of connection sometimes with Roman Catholicism at that moment. Great. Okay, so we've talked about not just some of her own experience of worship and her interest in universality, but another issue I want to dig into that I really found fascinating here is how profoundly individual her approaches to life and faith were, or at least her expressions of them. So you highlight this from the start. You mentioned in the preface her idiosyncratic embrace of her chosen religion, and then you foreground it again, page 1, chapter 1, quote, her independently chosen religious commitments. I would say the theme stood out most clearly for me, though, when you're unpacking her work as a columnist for Redbook, and these various terms, elect, choose, decide, they keep recurring. So describe for us a bit the interplay in her life of these two values, deeply held values, interdependence and autonomy.
So her own religious trajectory, her parents were both social scientists who were not religiously active. They were sort of post-Protestant with varying levels of edginess, although there was a grandmother in the household who had been a Methodist and pretty devout, but had to dial it back to not cause tension in the household about is going to church a thing that we do or not. Margaret was allowed to go to churches. She was in Bucks County in Philadelphia area as sociological research more than anything else. Often the family would have a cook or a maid, white ethnic, and it was more sure, go to church with her, see what her people do and are like. And Margaret ends up then checking that out. She goes to the Quaker meeting, which she's like, it's just a bunch of boring old people that never say anything. I'm not interested in that. Finds her way to the Episcopal Church. Her local Episcopal Church had a new rector whose daughter was about 9 years older than Margaret. Margaret just thinks these people are marvelous. She loves their household. She loves their church. She's drawn to the ritual aspects of it. And so then she decides she wants to be baptized against the wishes of her parents. And the Episcopal Church didn't have a great framework for that. Their baptismal liturgies are set up for the parents bringing the baby with a godparent. There isn't, 11-year-old shows up, it's like, okay, tell me what this is about and how do I do it? She chose her own godparents. She only had godmothers. She didn't want any godfathers. She didn't have one. So that was her own experience. It ends up being her daughter's experience as well. Margaret makes a deal with her husband, Gregory Bateson, who is an atheist. Okay, I won't raise her too Christian, although that often meant sending her to church with her friend Marie Eichelberger instead. Mary Catherine was in church choir, things like that. But Margaret wanted her to be able to make that decision as well. So then the next generation, Mary Catherine Bateson, wants to be baptized as a teenager, and the Episcopal Church still... It doesn't
hadn't addressed the issue.
No, it doesn't have reading materials on that. It's not really set up for that. They welcomed her. So then, even later, Margaret and her daughter are both involved with liturgical reform and renewal. Margaret gets called in as a consultant on the Book of Common Prayer revision, specifically on the ritual of baptism, because Margaret Mead's an expert on adolescence and rites of passage. And Margaret and Mary Catherine have all these ideas about ways to alter the ritual forms to be more intergenerational, because generation gap is a big issue. Loss of the next generation is a huge issue for mainline churches from that point forward. How do we recognize, especially younger people who want to have more autonomy in all spheres of their life, while still preserving a ritual like baptism as something that links you across generations back in time? Maybe they thought you could have multiple versions of a ritual. They also had ideas for all kinds of expanded rituals because, as Margaret pointed out, if you were going to die in the same house that you were born in, only solemnizing baptism, confirmation or first communion, wedding, funeral, that was probably enough. People's lives are so much more complicated. How can the church walk with these people who are on their own individual trajectories more effectively? And the Episcopal Church of the 70s was not quite ready to do that. There's only very minor changes to the ritual of baptism, although the one that Mary Catherine wrote, I think, is what she used for her own daughter. I think that's the only time that ritual was ever used was for Savon's baptism. So yeah, the individualism and community and continuity, those were both really strong impulses for Margaret Mead. And it was on rituals of baptism where I was able to see, okay, so what happens? Women's ordination was another one. What happens when two really strong impulses collide? She ended up being very inventive on baptism and very resistant on women's ordination.
Okay, while we're on the topic, let's jump to a question on that then. You make it clear in the book that Mead's legacy with regard to gender was somewhat complicated. We've discussed in some of her work, she kind of led the way in helping people understand the social construction of gender roles, but she was occasionally resistant to the idea of women's ordination, still insisted on at least some measure of biological difference, and even had testy relationships perhaps with certain second-wave feminists like Betty Friedan. So what should we think in terms of Mead's legacy and gender?
Very complicated. Ended up being a couple articles out beyond the book. Mead's 1935, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies. That's what is this bold statement that gender is that human beings are almost completely malleable, that societies tell them what it means to be gendered. You could say that the men should be the warriors and the women should be nurturing, or you can say the opposite, and either way, these people will be formed this way. It can work. Then her 1949 book, Male and Female, is much more saying, and very influenced by Freud, no, bodily experiences matter, especially bodily experiences related to reproduction. You can't override that entirely. And the second wave feminist, I mean, that's what earns her an entire chapter in Friedan's book, just like throws her under the bus. Those women felt so betrayed by her. They were so inspired by Mead's earlier work and felt so betrayed later, by which point Mead is a generation older than them. She was a mother when she's writing in Male and Female, how hard it is to have competition in the workplace between men and women. Well, she had married a succession of academics, and her prominence was more than, she's living that, although also not living the restrictions on gender, because she does get divorced 3 times and she is bisexual. So she seems to be living as a liberated woman while then coming around and telling women it might work better for everyone if you stayed home with kids, and they were just not having it at all. Meanwhile, Mead insists that she never changed her mind about that or anything else, that she always thought that gender was a combination of nature and nurture, and part of why she didn't talk about biology back in the 30s was the context of eugenics and Nazis.
Sure.
Talking about anything being biologically rooted just seemed so fraught, and then she just circled back around to it later. But that was not pleasing to the second wave feminists. Mead never really joined them on much of anything. She was asked, so what do you think about Betty Friedan's book, Femininity? She's like, it's not that interesting. But she held her own, and the women's ordination was one of the sort of last episodes in that. And you'd mentioned the Red Book column earlier. That's where Margaret Mead wrote about what she thought about women's ordination, was in Red Book.
Yeah.
And it was this strange story. I was looking for where she would comment on it, did not expect to find it there, and then found a draft of an article that was really not supportive of women's ordination at all. And I couldn't find anything with that headline ever having been published. So I thought, I guess she just never wrote about it. No, what she wrote was what was published under her name was so different than her initial read. Because, and I was able to piece this together in part by talking to Daniel Metro, Rhoda Metro wrote that. She was a little bit younger. She was more progressive on that. And Margaret was at least willing to put her name on it. But yeah, the way that the sort of back channel, and Margaret had her daughter also look at that draft. There's all these comments and markups. Margaret was not ready to go there. She was not ready to be sitting in church and look up front and see a woman. But her daughter was, and Rhoda was. And so she kind of tried to make her peace with it, but it was just really hard for her, in part because she was born in 1901. She was just of a different generation, and to try to think as a woman, in her 70s, one day I'm going to go to church and it's going to be a woman up front. And I think on some sort of visceral level, she just couldn't handle it.
Yeah. Well, what a great testament to the virtues of a mixed research method. I'm a big believer in archives, but as you say, there's certain things we can't always piece together just from seeing the documents, and being able to rely upon first-person testimony, an excellent way to unpack that puzzle there. So one issue we really haven't talked about is class. About halfway through the book, you write, there was much about contemporary American Christianity that she disdained, and seemingly little that she approved. So if I just pose the devil's advocate question, because that's what we academics are supposed to do, is it fair to say the things she approved were generally more elite concerns, and the things she disdained were middle class?
To an extent, yes. When she was so frustrated with churches in the middle of the 20th century, it was on race. And the churches just weren't progressive enough. And that wasn't only conservative or evangelical or what, I mean, the labels are in flux somewhat at that point. It was her own kind of churches too. And so she just had no patience for any of them. She's trying to do interracial work in New York. She's doing interfaith work with various Jewish committees that are trying to fight prejudice and anti-Semitism. And probably she was even more critical of her own kind of churches at that point, the the big, tall, steeple churches downtown just weren't getting with the program. And if you weren't working toward racial harmony and making a world that's more safe for difference, then you're part of the problem rather than the solution. Her preference for very high church worship, one of the churches she went to when she was at home in New York was St. Mary the Virgin, which is, I came to learn, notoriously high church. Her daughter relayed the joke that the Bishop of New York had a car running outside his office in case he would have to go over there and put down some effusion of popery. So back to the interface with Roman Catholicism. It's a gorgeous church. The ceiling painted with stars and professional musicians in the back. So yeah, that was her preference in worship. That is more liberal elite, that she thought of herself very cosmopolitan. She didn't engage with parish life much at all. She was a member of it was almost to think of, she was a member of the National Episcopal Church or the global, not just Anglican, but the World Council of Churches. Like that was really more her affiliation. That's very much elite to think of yourself that way. But then there are other sides of it. She was very open to parapsychology. And not just at the end of her life when she employs a faith healer, to the consternation of Rhoda and Mary Catherine and many other people. She always thought, I've seen things in the field that I can't explain, from the transcendence in Bali or other places. She had family members who considered themselves to be sensitives, to be able to perceive things that other people cannot see or hear. A relative was supposed to be able to fly around the room in a chair. And Mead does not have any kind of liberal East Coast academic disdain for that. Her posture was more like, maybe.
Yeah.
she would take that as an anthropologist. This is what they say about it. This is what it seems to do for them. I'm not making a judgment call on that. The way she embraced indigenous leadership of churches also, that's something that liberal Protestants are more apt to say than to do. So she, I think, could get out of some of the prejudice and proclivity of liberal cosmopolitan Protestants, at least at times.
Great. Well, I've got one more kind of big question. We'll start to narrow down after that, but I need to warn you about this one, historian to historian. It is a bit presentist. So many Americans at the moment are trying to make sense of how religion and politics should interact. You note in the book that activism was at the heart of Mead's faith, and we see her deploying religious justifications. We've mentioned some of them already, say against nuclear energy. But you also show in other settings, again, the Red Book columns, how at times she advanced the view, these are your words, that state-imposed religion was both divisive and false. So what do we know from Mead's life in terms of how she distinguished between when issues were appropriate for kind of moral intervention or activism and when they should stay private? And do you think her story suggests anything for those of us living in somewhat contested times?
That is a great and multivalent question. For all of her differences with second wave feminism, I think she would have agreed with the slogan that we know from that, the personal is political, which is different than talking about intervention, right? That's just saying that these aspects of being human have political ramifications, but not that then the state should intervene and control. She certainly, she didn't personally support abortion, but she thought that it was absolutely necessary that it be legal and accessible. It was not the sort of thing that could be mandated. The state regulation of, say, corporations, her last big project ended up being the National Council of Churches study on the plutonium economy, not something I thought I was going to have to know anything about when I undertook this.
In a religious biography, yes.
But that like pollution and the threat of nuclear meltdown was such a public health concern that it needed to be regulated, that she would have seen intervention for not telling people who they can marry, not telling them how they could structure their reproductive life, but giving advice on a wide range of things. She testified before Congress on drugs. She took a lot of flack for that. One of the charming stories to me, her 75th birthday party, she invites all of the guests to write notes to Jimmy Carter on what they wanted him to do. And she got them to him. He wasn't at the party, but that's what she thought would be a great party game. Having influence on political discourse, the messaging going that way, she was all in favor of. The messaging coming the other way, maybe not so much. But she was so interested in moral activism. One of her slogans was, during the Cold War, what we as Christians, we as Americans need to do is fight to make the world safe for other people's children. So that's an expansive moral agenda, but it never segued for her to, and thus we need to legislate family values. That would have been absolutely anathema to her.
Another instance maybe where we see these, not necessarily dueling, just coexistent values of autonomy and interdependence kind of informing her views on these topics. Great. Well, I want to make sure, even though I assembled some questions beforehand, I want to make sure to give you the kind of the last word here. What is the question I didn't ask that you wish I had, or what is the thing that you would love our audience to know about Margaret Mead's faith that we haven't yet discussed?
The main thing to know, maybe, is just that she was a Christian who thought theologically. She was not a theologian. She was definitely not trained as a theologian. She thought theologically about a wide range of topics that weren't otherwise being discussed. That little volume, 20th Century Faith, that nobody reads. She's talking about Christians in a technological era. She's talking about urban development. What's it going to mean for city churches when a city changes around them? She's talking about aging. She's talking about, again, how churches can walk through a wider range of life experiences with a wider range of people. There's some prescient stuff in there.
I was going to say, all things, this is a half century ago, but it sounds as if you could be describing someone's agenda right now.
Yeah. Even when she's talking in more traditional terms about gender roles, when women's roles change, men's roles are going to have to change as well. And this is going to be really complicated for child rearing. And these are the kind of supports that people need. It could have been written a week ago. So to invite people beyond my little pocket-sized volume to listen to some of the things that she was putting on the table and think both, how are these things still problems? What can we do? But for me, there was a tragedy. Why didn't we think about this 50 years ago? Could anything have been different if people had been listening to the types of concerns that she was raising back then?
Well, I'm afraid we have to wind up our conversation here, but I want to thank you so much, Elesha, for joining us today after so much delay and rescheduling amidst the pandemic. Again, the book is Margaret Mead, A 20th Century Faith. I encourage everyone to track down a copy. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a Cushwa event in the very near future.